Good morning, everybody. I'm Debbie Emerson, Hope's community health educator and certified dementia specialist. I'm also the facilitator of our family caregiver education program. And in addition to being in health education for over 30 years, I also have many years of experience caring for close family members with dementia. So I always try to bring to our presentations both my professional training and my personal experiences. And my co-presenter for today is Gia Barcel, Hope's Manager of Dementia Services. Gia.
Debbie. So, like Debbie mentioned, I'm Hope Hospice's Manager of Dementia Services and Community Education. I am a TIPA SNO certified dementia consultant and trainer. And I've been with Hope for about 8 years now. A couple of years before that, I was a volunteer for Hope Hospice. It's a wonderful organization, and we're so proud to be able to share this information with you throughout the community. So here's our outline for today. We'll be discussing normal aging, and note that that's in quotations. Typical or expected aging might be better terms to use. Certainly, any aging that any of us do is considered normal. But today we'll talk about how to tell the difference of when what you're doing is expected or when maybe you need to get a little additional information from a doctor. So we'll compare mild cognitive impairment to dementia and what each might look like. Mild cognitive impairment, in simple terms, is when older adults have more memory or thinking challenges than other adults their age. We'll talk about dementia. Dementia is the loss of cognitive functioning. So that's thinking, remembering, and reasoning. And behavioral abilities are affected as well, to such an extent that it interferes with a person's daily life and activities. And we'll take a look at some things that we can all do to stay healthy and reduce our chances of developing symptoms of mild cognitive impairment or dementia. And like Debbie mentioned, we left time at the end for questions. So as we go, please jot down any questions you may have, and we'll address them at the end.
Okay, thank you. The other thing, just a quick note, we are going to take a 5-minute break about midway through so that if you need to get up and stretch, you'll have the opportunity to do that. All right, so what do we mean by normal aging? First of all, agreeing with Gia, we don't love using the term normal to describe human behavior. I personally think it comes with a lot of biases, probably because the opposite of normal is abnormal, and that for sure has a negative connotation. Now, I much prefer, again, as Gia was mentioning, typical age-related changes or expected changes. But a lot of the literature and even experts use the term normal. So just for the sake of simplicity, I'm going to go with that today. Now, our bodies undergo many changes with aging. Our physical abilities actually can start to decline as young as age 30. Now, many of the changes that we experience in the aging process aren't necessarily harmful. They don't really interfere with our functioning. Now, if you're a baby boomer like me, you've probably already noticed some of these changes. It's also possible that you might not experience the same changes as your friends or loved ones. Now, we experience changes in pretty much every system in our body: our bones and muscles, our bladder and bowel, skin, vision, hearing. Our hearts have to work harder, and our cognitive abilities, memory and thinking, can change. As we age, we process information a bit more slowly, and we have a little bit more difficulty with multitasking. But routine memory, our basic skills, and our knowledge base are stable and actually may even improve with age. Remember, with age comes wisdom. There is no substitute for experience, especially if we make the effort to be lifelong learners and if we can learn from our mistakes. So normal aging means slowing down a little bit, not losing function. In other words, we are still very capable, we are still relevant, but it just may take us a bit longer to get where we want to go. Now, of course, when we start to notice these changes, we can't help but wonder, is this normal? Is it stress related? Or now we have that new, is it COVID related? COVID disrupted our lives in so many ways. and the distress still seems to be taking a toll on our physical health and on our mental health. I think that the last few years have made a lot of people feel like they were getting dementia symptoms. Stress is distracting, even if you don't consciously realize you're experiencing it. And here's why. Our brains tend to give worries and fears a high priority, thus blocking our memory for everyday things. So it's especially important to cut yourself some slack and try to keep that anxiety under control as much as you can. Deep breathing, daily meditation, even if only for a couple of minutes, can really work wonders. We also want to ask ourselves, is this behavior normal for the person? For example, I've always struggled with right and left, north and south. I call it my directional disability, but I found lots of little tricks to help me with it. The other day, a friend and I were driving to Oakland from Pleasanton, and I almost got on the on-ramp going east, towards Stockton, instead of west, until my friend caught my mistake. Now, of course, I felt really dumb, but I quickly explained to her that no, this isn't dementia. This is what I've done my entire life, but it was still really embarrassing. Now, if this had been a dramatic change from my normal functioning, there might be reason for concern. Another example, my husband has always had trouble recognizing faces. That's normal for him. Now, on the other hand, one of our first indicators that my mom was developing dementia was when she no longer could remember how to play a card game that she had played her entire life. So again, point being, it's important to consider what's typical for that person, for that individual. So let's take a look at some examples now of behaviors that we might see as we age. And if you do notice any of these, really, it's not too much to worry about. So this is from the Alzheimer's website. And so see if you can relate to any of these examples. Now, it's not unusual to make occasional errors when doing finances or paying household bills. These days, with so much online, it's easy to forget when we have to write a check for something. Or remember that the year is now 2023. When my husband retired a few years ago, one of his retirement gifts was this funky wall clock that had the days of the week on it instead of numbers. At first, we thought it was kind of dumb, but we soon came to realize that when one no longer has a routine of an everyday job, it's easy to forget not only the date, but the day of the week. However, it usually only takes a moment to remember. And of course, we have our trusty portable brains, also known as our phones. As long as we can remember how to use them, especially after installing a system upgrade or, heaven forbid, getting a new phone, electronics that are supposed to make our lives easier sure have a way of complicating things for those of us who didn't grow up in the computer generation. Excuse me. Do you ever have trouble finding the right word? The word or the name isn't lost forever. It may just take us longer to produce it. It's on the tip of our tongue. Some of us have little strategies or mnemonic devices to help us. I tend to go through the alphabet in my mind and can usually come up with the first letter of what I'm looking for, and that serves as a trigger. Or sometimes it'll just come to me in the middle of the night or the next day. Again, the memory hasn't decayed. It's just a little sluggish. And by the way, we still have the capacity to add to the storage banks in our brain. I always like to joke that my brain is full, but the reality is that our storage capacity is limitless. And the more new things we try to learn, actually, the better our brains are going to work for us. So this next one, I do it all the time, misplacing things and having to retrace my steps to find them. Sometimes it takes me a while to find something that ended up in an odd place, but once I find it, I can always remember how it got there. Now, that's a huge difference between typical aging and dementia. For example, if I can't immediately remember where I parked my car, once I wander around a bit or stop and think about where it might be, or remember to push the button on the key fob so my car will talk to me, I'm usually good. But if I had dementia, I may not be able to remember how I even got to the mall, or I may not recognize my car when I see it, or I may not remember how to drive it. Do you beat yourself up every time you do something dumb? And we all make mistakes or bad decisions on occasion. I found that with age, I can no longer multitask as easily as I used to. So now, to avoid mistakes, I need to slow down and remind myself to focus more on what I'm doing rather than going on autopilot like I was able to do in my younger days. And as we age, we get set in our ways. Part of it is just that we like to stay in our comfort zones. So we tend to get cranky when our routines are disrupted. We tend to get maybe impatient with others who are not doing things the way we would like them to. So there may be some little personality changes as we age, but most of them are related to the fact that change is hard and stressful, and that impacts our patience and our levels of tolerance. So today we're going to be looking at a spectrum or a continuum of changes that occur. We're going to look at the expected slowing down that I just talked about with age-related changes, to the more pronounced and troublesome issues that arise when someone has mild cognitive impairment. And then we'll look at the debilitating changes that occur when someone develops dementia. So, what is mild cognitive impairment? First of all, the word cognitive refers to anything that relates to our thinking abilities, remembering, problem solving, using logic, and interpreting information. Now, mild cognitive impairment is a stage on the continuum of cognitive decline, and it falls between normal aging and dementia. So it's characterized by impairment in thinking, memory, and judgment that is not severe enough to require help with the activities of daily living. So, in other words, the person is able to function independently. Now, MCI is an ambiguous condition because often the person with MCI appears to be healthy and able to function normally in many ways. Yet they begin to show some signs of memory loss, a little bit of confusion, and some apathy. Family members and friends who notice problems may not express concern because the early symptoms tend to mimic typical age-related changes. Now, important to note that there are many conditions that may produce temporary reversible indicators of MCI. So we always want to check for medication-related problems, especially if it's a new prescription. Is the behavior a symptom of another health condition, such as a urinary tract infection, dehydration, or depression? Or is it some type of vitamin or mineral deficiency? Now, is the fact that someone's not processing newly acquired information due to vision or hearing loss? We can't remember or understand information that we didn't see or hear in the first place. And behavior can change when someone experiences chronic pain, or lack of sleep, or excessive stress. So we don't want to rush to any conclusions that the person is showing signs of cognitive impairment until we've ruled out other possible causes for the changes in behavior. Now, according to the Alzheimer's Association, between 12 and 18% of individuals over the age of 60 experience mild cognitive impairment. So, how many people with MCI will develop dementia? The data vary depending on the reference site used. The Alzheimer's Association says about 1/3 of all people with MCI will most likely develop Alzheimer's disease within about 5 years. Now, this is a really hard statistic to get right because there's so many variables. But the most important takeaway for you is that yes, some people with MCI will get progressively worse, but in a big but, a larger percentage of them will never get worse. And in some individuals, their cognitive abilities remain stable or even get better. Now, the most common form of MCI is the type where the person complains of memory issues. And this is the type that may be a precursor of Alzheimer's disease. The other type of MCI affects thinking skills other than memory, including the ability to make sound decisions, to judge time, or the sequence of steps needed to complete a complex task, or interpreting visual cues. In other words, gauging depth perception, for example. Now, people with MCI may recognize that they're having trouble, but they are still able to carry out most of their usual activities and can live independently. So, MCI is not life-altering, but it's understandable that it can be a cause for concern. Now, there's a lot of research being conducted now to determine if MCI is actually an early stage of Alzheimer's. Right now, we just don't know for sure, because remember, not everyone with MCI gets worse. Are there treatments? Well, again, another very active area of research. Studies are underway to better understand MCI, this disorder, and to find treatments that might improve symptoms or prevent or delay progression to dementia. Got to tell you though, there's really no over-the-counter treatments. Now, those with MCI may benefit from the new treatments that have just been approved, Aduhelm and Leqembi. And these are called disease-altering medications. And I'm going to talk about those a little bit more at the end of the presentation. So let's take a look at some symptoms. And important to note that these symptoms, which are mostly changes in behavior and personality, don't occur suddenly, but they gradually worsen over time. Remember, if we see a sudden change in behavior, we need to look at other possible causes, such as a medication-related problem, a possible TIA, the little strokes, or a medical condition such as a urinary tract infection. Now, I mentioned those memory issues that occur as we age, but people with MCI will have more frequent difficulty remembering simple things. They may experience difficulty following a conversation or basic instructions, and may frequently lose their train of thought as they're speaking. Forgetting appointments or scheduled events becomes more apparent and frequent than we see in typical aging. And since MCI can impact mood and temperament, persons may more easily feel overwhelmed when unable to make plans or decisions. And it's more than just the typical crankiness that we experience when things don't go our way. So with normal aging, we may get lost in unfamiliar places, happens all the time, or forgetting where we parked our car. But the person with MCI has trouble finding their way around familiar environments, their own neighborhood or local shopping areas. They may forget how to get home. We may see increased impulsivity, making decisions and acting without thought. And we may see more cases of poor judgment. Sometimes the social filter isn't working properly, and people can say and do things that may be out of character for them. Now, all of these changes can be distressing to the person. And as a result, they may experience emotional symptoms such as depression, anxiety, irritability, apathy. Again, it's important to remember these changes will come about gradually. If there are sudden changes, we always need to look for other causes and contact a physician. Okay, I really don't like the information on this slide, and you'll see why in a second. The causes of MCI are not clear, but it appears that some of the same risks for Alzheimer's disease are also risks for MCI. And those risks include being age 65 or older, having a family history of MCI, Alzheimer's disease, or another form of dementia, having certain medical conditions such as high blood pressure, diabetes, stroke, high cholesterol, or heart disease, substance abuse, including alcohol, and lack of exercise. Okay, have we seen this list somewhere before? I wish I had more specific information because all of these factors can actually point to a lot of things. But when coming up with possible causes, that's kind of it. Now, there's no specific test to confirm a diagnosis of mild cognitive impairment. A physician will decide whether MCI is the most likely cause of symptoms based on the information the person provides and the results of various tests that can help clarify the diagnosis. And this is mostly done by ruling out other possible causes. So, a typical medical workup for MCI includes the following elements: a thorough medical history, where the physician documents current symptoms, previous illnesses, and medical conditions. They'll also look for any family history of significant memory problems or dementia. They'll do an assessment of independent functioning and daily activities. And again, we're going to be focusing on any changes from the person's usual level of functioning. A good example may be driving. Is the person getting lost more frequently? Are they having more accidents? Or have there been more mishaps in the kitchen? Is the person paying less attention to hygiene and grooming? The physician will seek input from a family member or a trusted friend to produce additional perspective on how that person's abilities may have changed. Now, mental status can be assessed using brief tests designed to evaluate memory, planning, judgment, ability to understand visual information, and other key thinking skills. An in-office neurological examination may be conducted to assess the function of nerves and reflexes, movement, coordination, balance, and senses. We know that the brain changes that occur as a result of many different dementias can impact not only our cognitive abilities, but our reflexes, our coordination, and our balance. They'll evaluate mood to see if any depression is involved. Now, if the physician feels that MCI is a possibility, they may order lab tests, including blood tests and imaging of the brain structure. If Alzheimer's is suspected, they may do tests to determine if there's a buildup of beta amyloid, and that's that substance in the brain that may indicate Alzheimer's. Again, most of the tests are done to rule out other causes, such as brain tumors or stroke. Now, if the workup doesn't create a clear clinical picture, the doctor may recommend neuropsychological testing. And this involves a series of written or computerized tests to evaluate specific thinking skills. Now, these are the same tests that may be given to someone when dementia is suspected. However, if a person has MCI, their scores on these cognitive functioning tests will be significantly better than one who has dementia. Because remember, MCI is not dementia. But brain imaging and medical research have shown actually that some people with MCI also have the plaques, the tangles, and the shrinkage in the memory center of the brain that's observed in those who have Alzheimer's. So there's a lot of research being conducted now to determine if MCI is actually an early stage of Alzheimer's. But right now, unfortunately, we just don't know. So what if we get an MCI diagnosis? Gia, can you give us some tips on this?
I am on it. So, mild cognitive impairment can make one feel frustrated and anxious. And to cope with this, there are some strategies to help compensate for any memory decline that interferes with the enjoyment of life, the effectiveness at work, relationships, and goals for the future. So here's what we want to share with the person who has been diagnosed with MCI. First of all, be patient with yourself and ask your family to be patient with you. Understand that you may feel frustrated, anxious, or sad when you recognize that you've lost some abilities. Slowing down and taking your time can sometimes make it easier to remember or to complete a task. Discuss with a family member or another trusted person your preferences for decisions that are going to affect your life, just in case the MCI does progress to dementia. Be sure to have all legal and financial matters in order. This will help your loved ones provide you with the type of care that you want and need in the future, should you be unable to state those preferences. Meet with a lawyer knowledgeable about estate planning to draft a will, set up a trust, or handle other related legal matters. You can also use visible and/or accessible reminders. Useful strategies might include writing notes to yourself or putting Post-its around the house. Putting up a large calendar on a whiteboard to track appointments can help everyone in the family. You can set the alarm on your phone or your tablet to ping when there's an upcoming event. And there's even new medication dispensing systems that are really helpful. And they range from those simple little plastic boxes with the days of the week on them to some high-tech ones that automatically dispense meds and remind you if you've forgotten. Find constructive ways to release any anger and frustration you may feel. Exercise is great. It contributes to good physical health, can reduce stress, and helps keep your brain as healthy as possible. Talk with a close friend or consider joining a support group for people with memory loss. And keep your mind active doing things that you enjoy. Work on puzzles, read the paper, play cards, listen to music, write in a journal, learn something new. Do volunteer work. The new pickleball craze I'm hearing is wonderful, so play pickleball. Attend webinars like you're doing today, or listen to podcasts. The options are endless, and it's all about what works for you. Continue to explore ways to fulfill your needs for intimacy and closeness. Participate in family events and keep in touch with friends. The desire for close relationships with others continues throughout life, regardless of cognitive abilities. Know that you're more than just someone with MCI. It's hard when we get some kind of a troubling diagnosis. Sometimes we focus only on that diagnosis and we can lose sight of the fact that who we are as a person is so much more than a label. And focus on your present abilities and try and avoid worrying too much about what might happen in the future. Know that there are many ways to live an active and productive life. So focus on what you can do, not on what you can't. If you have any concerns about memory and thinking skills, either for yourself or a loved one, it's so important to schedule an appointment with your physician. I know that sometimes ignorance is bliss, but when it comes to your brain health, knowledge is power. And it's become somewhat of a cliche, but it's also true. The key to surviving anything is developing healthy habits and maintaining a healthy, active lifestyle.
So the first question is it or is it not dementia? But we actually have a question before that. Normal aging, not normal aging. Because before we start assuming it's dementia, what we need to figure out is this normal for this person or is something changing? And if it's changing, is it necessarily permanent or could it be something that we could fix, we could address, we could modify? A couple of examples to keep in mind would be something like depression, which is treatable, hypothyroid, treatable, medication problems, treatable, even a problem with hearing that nobody's picked up on, or a problem with vision, or a problem with a new medical condition, maybe like diabetes or something. So what you want to notice first is there a change? Is something changing? And don't make assumptions. We want to check things out. People deserve a good workup. We don't want to think, oh yeah, look, it's not normal, it's dementia. We want to think, I don't know that this is normal for this person. Something seems to be changing. And if we notice the change, we want to find out, can we do something? And if we do that and we're still going, something's going on here, we don't want to make the next leap, which is, it's got to be Alzheimer's. It's bound to be Alzheimer's. Not necessarily. This is where there's a lot of misunderstanding about what's dementia and what's Alzheimer's. And what does it mean? It doesn't mean memory problems. When we talk about dementia, we need to be thinking about a great big umbrella term. A great big umbrella, as a matter of fact, that we find underneath that umbrella approximately 85 to 90 different conditions, forms, causes of this thing called dementia. And dementia is not maybe what you think it is. It's more, and it's different. Alzheimer's is under there. It's certainly one of the big boxes under there, but it's not the only box. And what we used to think, 80 to 90% of all dementias are Alzheimer's. And now we know they may be mixed pictures, a couple, or a different one entirely. Things like Lewy body or frontal temporal dementias, or maybe vascular dementia, or dementia that comes with a health condition. And we think now that dementia actually isn't a diagnosis. So if somebody has been diagnosed as having dementia, something's not right already, because you don't get a diagnosis of dementia. When you have dementia, you have a syndrome, a collection of symptoms. So what do we want to do? Well, we want to know we're under the umbrella. Well, what does it mean to be under the umbrella, to have dementia? Well, it means 4 things, typically. Number 1, at least 2 parts of your brain are dying. They're changing, and we can't fix them right now. So your brain is changing on you, at least 2 parts. One of them will typically be related to memory, but not always in the way we think about. It's not always the can't remember new things, but do remember old things. For alcohol-related dementia, I have blackouts, but they might be a variety of blacked out or missing pieces. For vascular, I again could have a whole bunch of different memory issues. And for frontal temporal, I may think something happened that you don't remember happening. So with memory, it's important to recognize it's not just the standard thing. Now, the second thing that's true about all dementias is that right now, we currently have nothing that's going to fix it, cure it, make it go away, or even stop it in its tracks. So what we have to realize is we're going to have to figure out how to help somebody live with it. And on average, for all the dementias, if we considered all of them, we'd be talking about 8 to 12 years of symptoms. Now, it could be shorter, it could be longer, but 8 to 12 years is a long time to endure something that the third thing that's true about all dementias is constantly changing. And it's constantly changing because this is a neurodegenerative or a progressive illness. It's not going to stop until it's over. And now we get to the fourth thing that's true about all dementias. They're all terminal. But frankly, so's life. So what we've got to stop thinking is, oh no, and start going, oh, I'm going to have to make some changes. I'm going to have to do something because I am living with someone who's living under the umbrella. Now, let me say that again. When one person gets dementia, it doesn't just affect that one person. Everyone around them is going to be living with dementia one way or the other. So this one person got chosen, but it's not a choice they would have ever made. You choose. And the question is, will you pull together and support that person? Or will you fall apart and walk away? Will you wear yourself out and not make a positive difference? The purpose and the reason I do what I do is to help you do what you do. And that's where we can make the change happen. I can't change the condition. I can't make the changes stop. But what I can do is offer you ways to start changing to better match what they're able to do, to acknowledge what's missing and use what they still have left. There's life under the umbrella for all of us. Life under the umbrella is a challenge when it's in you, but it's also a challenge when you're living with the person who's experiencing it. The choice is yours. With dementia, let's pull together, let's change, because the change is happening.
So key takeaways from Teepa's video. Obviously, this list in front of you is a little bit about it, but worth noting is that dementia is not a disease. It's a general term for memory loss, language challenges or loss, challenges with problem solving, and other thinking abilities that impair thinking and behavior. And in the video, Teepa describes it as a syndrome. So dementia is an umbrella term. It's a group of symptoms, and all of the underlying diseases that can cause dementia symptoms fall under that umbrella. Those might include Alzheimer's, strokes or TIAs, Parkinson's disease, and Lewy body dementia. So, for example, if someone were to say, my mom was just diagnosed with dementia, it's appropriate to say, oh, well, what type of dementia? Well, my mom has Alzheimer's dementia, or my mom has Parkinson's disease associated dementia. I hope that clears up the difference in terms a little bit. There are 3 undisputable facts about dementia. All dementias are chronic, they're all progressive, and they're all terminal. In general, memory and language tend to decline first, but ultimately, all brain functions end up being impacted. And because persons living with dementia lose their ability to communicate with language, they end up relying on their behaviors to let us know what their needs and wants are. And then it's up to us to decipher those needs and wants and to respond appropriately. Dementia doesn't just affect the person living with dementia. It affects everyone around them on a 24-hour, 7-day-a-week basis. It's said that caring for someone living with dementia is the most stressful of all caregiver roles for a number of reasons, but possibly most prominently because the person living with dementia is constantly changing as the brain is constantly changing. So, like I was talking about before, our next slide shows us a picture of that dementia umbrella. So remember, dementia is not a disease in and of itself. It's a syndrome. It's a group of associated symptoms. And there are many diseases that are the dementia culprit. So let's talk about each one of these just a little bit. Alzheimer's. Alzheimer's is the most common form of dementia, making up approximately 60 to 80% of dementia symptom diagnoses. Recent memory is first to go in Alzheimer's, and it also involves language problems. For example, maybe you'll see someone misspeak or misunderstand. You may also see an increase in impulsivity, and their awareness of time and place may get fuddled. Vascular dementia, otherwise known as multi-infarct dementia. It's the second most common form of dementia. And in vascular dementia, changes in thinking skills usually occur suddenly after a stroke. This is because there is a reduction of blood flow to various parts of the brain, thus depriving the brain of oxygen and nutrients. Vascular dementia is also the least predictable of the dementias. You'll most likely see an emotional instability, which might look like heightened irritability and then uncontrollable laughing and then crying. Lewy body dementia is the third most common form of dementia. Lewy body dementia is when an abnormal amount of protein deposits, called Lewy bodies, develop in the nerve cells in the brain regions that involve thinking, memory, and movement. Lewy bodies are also found in Alzheimer's and Parkinson's disease. And you'll typically see a lot of fluctuating behavioral, memory problems, and motor problems. Persons with Lewy body dementia will experience movement symptoms such as hunched posture or rigid muscles, maybe a shuffling walk, and trouble initiating movement. Additionally, hallucinations, delusions, and sleep disturbances are common. Frontotemporal dementia. This usually appears between the ages of 40 and 65. And unfortunately, it's often misdiagnosed as a psychological problem. FTD affects as the name suggests, the frontal and temporal lobes of the brain. Usually symptoms present as behavioral and or language disorders. So commonly you'll see changes in social and personal behavior, maybe apathy, the blunting of emotions, and loss in both expressive and receptive language. That would look like a person's personality, their speech, their ability to reason, and their social judgment. Lastly, mixed dementias. Mixed dementia is when the brain change comes from more than one cause, and they all occur simultaneously. Most people with mixed dementias are diagnosed with a single type of dementia, and in most cases, symptoms are similar to the symptoms of Alzheimer's. As with Alzheimer's, a definitive diagnosis can only be made after death when an autopsy is conducted. And the symptoms of mixed dementia can be varying depending on the parts of the brain that end up being affected. So, since there are no cures for these irreversible dementias, as caregivers, we need to focus our attention on ways to maximize our loved one's cognitive and behavioral functioning, beginning with an understanding of how dementia manifests itself. This slide gives us examples of some changes that you may see that might indicate dementia. Memory loss that disrupts daily life, getting lost in previously familiar surroundings, not being able to follow instructions or follow progressive steps, as well as not being able to create steps to accomplish a goal. Difficulty maintaining the concentration to start and or complete familiar tasks. That might look like bathing or simply getting dressed. Getting lost or stuck in a time or place. An example of this might look like an 80-year-old retired school teacher thinking that they're late to teach their class and that the students are waiting for them to arrive. Sometimes they may forget where they are or how they got there. Visual and spatial challenges present when the occipital lobe of the brain is affected by dementia. So sometimes we may see someone reaching out to grab a seemingly individual object. This can be prompted by maybe a shadow on the wall that they interpret as something tangible. Language challenges can be one of the first symptoms experienced and might look like unintentionally substituting a word related to the one they're searching for. For example, saying book instead of newspaper, or jumbling words up in the wrong order. They may move from one topic to another without finishing a sentence. Misplacing things and having the inability to retrace their steps to find the lost item. Poor judgment and the loss of social filters, withdrawal from activities from previously enjoyable activities, and lastly, changes in mood or mood swings. So, evaluating symptoms. When warning signs of Alzheimer's or other dementias appear, it's important that you get a prompt and accurate diagnosis. To determine if your symptoms indicate dementia, your medical history, your medication history, and your symptoms will be reviewed by your primary care doctor, a neurologist, or a geriatrician. Your doctor will also conduct several tests. During your appointment, your doctor will evaluate whether you have impaired memory or thinking skills, whether you exhibit changes in personality or behavior, the degree of your memory or thinking impairment or changes, and how your thinking problems affect your ability to function in daily life. A doctor will probably also try and determine the cause of your symptoms. They may order additional lab tests, brain imaging tests, or send you for more extensive memory testing. These tests can provide doctors with useful information for diagnosis, including ruling out other conditions that can cause similar symptoms. Alzheimer's dementia results from the progressive loss of brain cells, and this degeneration may show up in a variety of brain scans. However, these scans alone aren't enough to make a diagnosis. So scans aren't used to diagnose the condition because there is overlap in what doctors consider, quote, normal age-related change in the brain and abnormal change. However, brain imaging can help rule out other causes, such as hemorrhages, brain tumors, or strokes. Distinguish between differing types of degenerative brain disease and establishing a baseline about the degree of the degeneration are equally important and considered. The General Practitioner Assessment of Cognition, so that's GPCOG, is a screening tool for cognitive impairment, and it's been designed for general practitioners, primary care physicians, and family doctors. So if someone refers to that, now you know that it's just an additional test. There's also the mini-cog test and the MoCA test, the Montreal Cognitive Assessment. So when someone is living with dementia, what does that mean and what can we do? A diagnosis of dementia does not mean that life is over. It means that there will be challenges ahead. Thinking about those challenges now will help prepare you and those close to you for what the future may hold. So how do we cope? Well, these suggestions for how to cope are very similar to the MCI coping strategies. And there's no magic prescription on what steps to go through or what the journey is going to look like. So it's individual for everyone. But in general, first and foremost, try to remain as independent as possible for as long as possible. Second, feel like you have control over your life wherever you can. 3, maintain healthy relationships with your family and friends. As we mentioned earlier, that need for connection with people doesn't go anywhere, even if you're living with a diagnosis of dementia. Stay physically active and as socially engaged as you ordinarily would. Strive to maintain the highest quality of life possible. And by the way, there's a handout on our website that gives this info and more when you click on the link to this website after we post it when we're done.
Okay, thank you, Gia. Just a note, Gia went through, some information, really important information about dementia. But our webinar that we're going to be doing in September is an hour and a half that is only about dementia. So it's going to give you lots more information. If you can't wait until then, or if you're unable to attend that one, we do have some resources on that online resource list that you have or that you will be able to download, and lots of really good info about dementia in general on that. So that's available to you. Okay. So remember earlier how I said that just like most things that relate to human beings, our cognitive abilities are on a spectrum or a continuum, from fully functioning to not so much. So let's just review the spectrum. Okay, in typical aging, we function independently, but we may process information more slowly. We may be forgetful on occasion, but we're able to complete tasks, although multitasking can become somewhat of a challenge. We get confused sometimes. We may misplace things, but we're usually able to retrace our steps to find them. We'll make occasional errors in judgment and usually beat ourselves up for doing so. And as we age, we become more set in our ways, and we can get more easily irritated or agitated. If someone has MCI, then normal functioning may be impacted, but remember, it's not life-altering. Memory issues will become more frequent, and they're going to lose their train of thought more often when speaking. There's much greater difficulty when trying to do more than one thing at once, multitasking. We see increased impulsivity, acting without thinking about consequences, may see poor judgment. The person may get lost more easily in familiar environments. And then all of this is accompanied by increased emotionality, depression, anxiety, and irritability, mainly because the person is aware that things are changing and they're fearful that dementia may be just around the corner. And then once someone's been diagnosed with a neurocognitive disorder that produces the symptoms of dementia, like the ones that Gia talked about earlier in that umbrella slide, they're going to have an increased need for others to help with activities of daily living due to more serious problems with memory. Communication skills are impacted, both in speaking and in understanding. The person is often confused and disoriented. They have attention deficits, which means that they're unable to stay on task, unable to concentrate or focus. Now, with dementia, we see a loss in both gross and fine motor skills. Coordination and balance are impacted, and the person's at greater risk for falls. The changes in mood and personality are significant. So the graphic, as you may have noticed, just kind of summarizes everything that we've talked about today. And I hope it helps you to better understand this continuum. And again, if you have any concerns about any of this, the first step is to see your doctor. And he or she can start with a screening and then, if necessary, a referral to a specialist. Sometimes people say, well, what's the use of seeing a doctor? I already know there's stuff going on. It's always really important to get what's called a baseline evaluation, so that if there are more changes in the future, you'll have something to compare it with. The other thing is a lot of the new meds that are coming out work best in the very, very early stages. Okay, Gia and I are always being asked, can dementia be prevented? Are there treatments? Are there medications that work? Unfortunately, as of right now, answers are not conclusive. There's still a lot of research being conducted, especially with Alzheimer's, since it does tend to be the most common condition that causes dementia. But since the brain changes that produce dementia start about 20, even 30 years before we see any symptoms, it's a tough one. Now, as I mentioned, there are some new treatments that have just been approved, and I'll talk about those in just a minute. By the way, just to note, I'm in the process of developing a new class that is entirely about risk reduction strategies for, hopefully, reducing our chances of becoming cognitively impaired. So be on the lookout for that in my newsletters. And so right now, I'm just going to give you a really quick look at the things that we can do. So there are things that can be done, especially when we're young. However, just because we're not 30 anymore and we're already starting to show signs of age-related changes, it doesn't mean that we're doomed and there's nothing we can do, because it is never too late to adopt healthful habits. And remember, dementia isn't only caused by Alzheimer's. Vascular dementia is the second most common cause. And so we need to do things that have been shown to reduce our risk of cardiovascular disease or other issues. Remember, what's good for the heart is also good for the brain. So of course, eating a balanced diet, watching the blood pressure levels, exercising, don't smoke, and watch the consumption of alcohol. Try to keep stress levels under control. I know, easier said than done. But as I mentioned earlier, simple meditation and deep breathing can make a world of difference. Be sure that you're getting good sleep. 7 to 9 hours a night is usually recommended. And here may be a new one for you. Be sure to get your vaccines. There is growing evidence that Alzheimer's may be caused or triggered by common infections that may result in something called chronic inflammation. So it is highly recommended that you get all of your vaccines, your annual flu vaccines, the new shingles vaccine for people over 50. That one's given in 2 doses, a few months apart, but then you're good for the rest of your life. Now, the latest research I've seen indicates that there's a connection between shingles and Alzheimer's. So that's a real important one. And of course, the pneumonia vaccines. By the way, there's a new one out now, of course, just to confuse us even more, but talk with your doctors or pharmacist about that. COVID vaccines are also so important. Now, they won't necessarily prevent you from getting COVID, but they can definitely keep you from getting really sick and ending up in the hospital. And I just read something, I believe it was yesterday, day before, that Medicare is now paying for pretty much all of your vaccines. In the past, they didn't pay for the shingles vaccine. When I got mine, I believe they're like a couple $100 per shot. So it's kind of adding insult to injury on those. But Medicare has now, as of January 1st, I believe, of this past year, is paying there'll be no cost to consumers for any of these vaccines. So that's a really good thing. So if money was preventing you from doing that, besides the fact that they hurt and their side effects sometimes, don't use the money as an excuse anymore. Okay, the very last point on my slide is really, really crucial. Engage in activities that make you think. Learn something new. Read a book or an article that's intellectually challenging. Now, crosswords are great, very relaxing. Sudoku, some people really love that and find that to be relaxing. So please don't stop any of those, brain activities that you enjoy. However, if you really want to do the most for your brain, it's so important that you learn new things. And I'm going to show you a video in just a second that's going to explain a little bit more about that. So this is one of my very favorite TED Talks. If you've been with me for a while, you've seen this one. Now, I don't love the title of this. It's called What You Can Do to Prevent Alzheimer's, because right now we really can't, but it's one that sure gets our attention. So at this point, again, we can't really prevent it or other dementias, but as I mentioned, we can reduce the risk and possibly stave off some of the symptoms. Now, Dr. Lisa Genova is a Harvard-educated neuroscientist and author of the best-selling book about early onset Alzheimer's, Still Alice. Some of you may have read that book or seen the movie with Julianne Moore. She's written a couple of other really good books. In fact, her most recent one is called Remember. And I'm about halfway through that right now. I'm loving it, mostly because it really does explain the process of memory, but most importantly for me, it's making me feel better about all those things that I tend to be forgetting these days. So I do recommend that, and I believe I did put that on my on the resource list. So Remember by Lisa Genova. I think it was published in 2021. So this particular TED Talk was produced about 5 years ago, but the information is still accurate with one tiny exception, and I'll talk about that later. Well, actually, I'll mention it right now. The tiny little difference is that we do now have a couple of new meds on the market that are looking real promising.
Let's project out into the future, to your future yous, and let's imagine that we're all 85. Now, everyone look at 2 people. One of you probably has Alzheimer's disease. All right. And maybe you're thinking, well, it won't be me. Then, okay, you are a caregiver. So in some way, this terrifying disease is likely to affect us all. Part of the fear around Alzheimer's stems from the sense that there's nothing we can do about it. Despite decades of research, we still have no disease-modifying treatment and no cure. So if we're lucky enough to live long enough, Alzheimer's appears to be our brain's destiny. But maybe it doesn't have to be. What if I told you we could change these statistics, literally change our brain's destiny without relying on a cure or advancements in medicine? Let's begin by looking at what we currently understand about the neuroscience of Alzheimer's. Here's a picture of two neurons connecting. The point of connection, this space circled in red, is called a synapse. The synapse is where neurotransmitters are released. This is where signals are transmitted, where communication happens. This is where we think, feel, see, hear, desire, and remember. And the synapse is where Alzheimer's happens. Let's zoom in on the synapse and look at a cartoon representation of what's going on. During the business of communicating information, in addition to releasing neurotransmitters like glutamate into the synapse, neurons also release a small peptide called amyloid beta. Normally, amyloid beta is cleared away and metabolized by microglia, the janitor cells of our brains. While the molecular causes of Alzheimer's are still debated, most neuroscientists believe that the disease begins when amyloid beta begins to accumulate. Too much is released or not enough is cleared away, and the synapse begins to pile up with amyloid beta. And when this happens, it binds to itself, forming sticky aggregates called amyloid plaques. How many people here are 40 years old or older? Yeah, you're afraid to admit it now. This initial step into the disease, this presence of amyloid plaques accumulating, can already be found in your brains. Now, the only way we could be sure of this would be through a PET scan, because at this point, you are blissfully unaware. You're not showing any impairments in memory, language, or cognition yet. We think it takes at least 15 to 20 years of amyloid plaque accumulation before it reaches a tipping point, then triggering a molecular cascade that causes the clinical symptoms of the disease. Prior to the tipping point, your lapses in memory might include things like, why did I come in this room? Or, oh, what's his name? Or where did I put my keys? Yeah, now before you all start freaking out again, because I know half of you did at least one of those in the last 24 hours. These are all normal kinds of forgetting. In fact, I would argue that these examples might not even involve your memory because you didn't pay attention to where you put your keys in the first place. After the tipping point, the glitches in memory, language, and cognition are different. Instead of eventually finding your keys in your coat pocket or on the table by the door, you find them in the refrigerator. Or you find them and you think, what are these for? Okay, so what happens when amyloid plaques accumulate to this tipping point? Our microglia janitor cells become hyperactivated, releasing chemicals that cause inflammation and cellular damage. We think they might actually start clearing away the synapses themselves. A crucial neural transport protein called tau becomes hyperphosphorylated and twists itself into something called tangles, which choke off the neurons from the inside. By mid-stage Alzheimer's, we have massive inflammation in tangles and all-out war at the synapse and cell death. So if you are a scientist trying to cure this disease, at what point would you ideally want to intervene? Many scientists are betting big on the simplest solution: keep amyloid plaques from reaching that tipping point, which means that drug discovery is largely focused on developing a compound that will prevent, eliminate, or reduce amyloid plaque accumulation. And so the cure for Alzheimer's will likely be a preventative medicine. We're going to have to take this pill before we reach that tipping point, before the cascade is triggered, before we start leaving our keys in the refrigerator. We think this is why, to date, these kinds of drugs have failed in clinical trials, not because the science wasn't sound, but because the people in these trials were already symptomatic. It was too late. Think of amyloid plaques as a lit match. At the tipping point, the match sets fire to the forest. Once the forest is ablaze, it doesn't do any good to blow out the match. You have to blow out the match before the forest catches fire. Even before scientists sort this out, this information is actually really good news for us because it turns out that the way we live can influence the accumulation of amyloid plaques. And so there are things we can do to keep us from reaching that tipping point. Let's picture your risk of Alzheimer's as a seesaw scale. We're going to pile risk factors on one arm, and when that arm hits the floor, you are symptomatic and diagnosed with Alzheimer's. Let's imagine you're 50 years old. You're not a spring chicken anymore, so you've accumulated some amyloid plaques with age. Your scale is tipped a little bit. Now let's look at your DNA. We've all inherited our genes from our moms and our dads. Some of these genes will increase our risk and some will decrease it. If you're like Alice and still Alice, you've inherited a rare genetic mutation that cranks out amyloid beta, and this alone will tip your scale arm to the ground. But for most of us, the genes we inherit will only tip the arm a bit. For example, ApoE4 is a gene variant that increases amyloid, but you can inherit a copy of ApoE4 from mom and dad and still never get Alzheimer's, which means that for most of us, our DNA alone does not determine whether we get Alzheimer's. So what does? We can't do anything about getting older or the genes we've inherited. So far, we haven't changed our brain's destiny. What about sleep? In slow wave deep sleep, our glial cells rinse cerebral spinal fluid throughout our brains, clearing away metabolic waste that accumulated in our synapses while we were awake. Deep sleep is like a power cleanse for the brain. But what happens if you shortchange yourself on sleep? Many scientists believe that poor sleep hygiene might actually be a predictor of Alzheimer's. A single night of sleep deprivation leads to an increase in amyloid beta. And amyloid accumulation has been shown to disrupt sleep, which in turn causes more amyloid to accumulate. And so now we have this positive feedback loop that's going to accelerate the tipping of that scale. What else? Cardiovascular health. High blood pressure, diabetes, obesity, smoking, high cholesterol have all been shown to increase our risk of developing Alzheimer's. Some autopsy studies have shown that as many as 80% of people with Alzheimer's also had cardiovascular disease. Aerobic exercise has been shown in many studies to decrease amyloid beta in animal models of the disease. So a heart-healthy Mediterranean lifestyle and diet can help to counter the tipping of this scale. Okay, so there are many things we can do to prevent or delay the onset of Alzheimer's, but let's say you haven't done any of them. Let's say you're 65. There's Alzheimer's in your family, so you've likely inherited a gene or two that tips your scale arm a bit. You've been burning the candle at both ends for years. You love bacon, and you don't run unless someone's chasing you. Let's imagine that your amyloid plaques have reached that tipping point. Your scale arm has crashed to the floor. You've tripped the cascade, setting fire to the forest, causing inflammation, tangles, and cell death. You should be symptomatic for Alzheimer's. You should be having trouble finding words and keys and remembering what I said at the beginning of this talk. But you might not be. There's one more thing you can do to protect yourself from experiencing the symptoms of Alzheimer's, even if you have the full-blown disease pathology ablaze in your brain. It has to do with neuroplasticity and cognitive reserve. Remember, the experience of having Alzheimer's is ultimately a result of losing synapses. The average brain has over 100 trillion synapses, which is fantastic. We've got a lot to work with. And this isn't a static number. We gain and lose synapses all the time through a process called neuroplasticity. Every time we learn something new, we are creating and strengthening new neural connections, new synapses. In the nun study, 678 nuns, all over the age of 75 when the study began, were followed for more than 2 decades. They were regularly given physical checkups and cognitive tests, and when they died, their brains were all donated for autopsy. In some of these brains, scientists discovered something surprising. Despite the presence of plaques and tangles and brain shrinkage, what appeared to be unquestionable Alzheimer's, the nuns who had belonged to these brains showed no signs of having the disease while they were alive. How can this be? We think it's because these nuns had a high level of cognitive reserve, which is a way of saying that they had more functional synapses. People who have more years of formal education, who have a high degree of literacy, who engage regularly in mentally stimulating activities, all have more cognitive reserve. They have an abundance and a redundancy in neural connections. So even if they have a disease like Alzheimer's, compromising some of their synapses, they've got many extra backup connections, and this buffers them from noticing that anything is amiss. Let's imagine a simplified example. Let's say you only know one thing about a subject. Let's say it's about me. You know that Lisa Genova wrote Still Alice, and that's the only thing you know about me. You have that single neural connection, that one synapse. Now imagine you have Alzheimer's. You have plaques and tangles and inflammation and microglia devouring that synapse. Now when someone asks you, hey, who wrote Still Alice? You can't remember because that synapse is either failing or gone. You've forgotten me forever. But what if you had learned more about me? Let's say you learned 4 things about me. Now imagine you have Alzheimer's and 3 of those synapses are damaged or destroyed. You still have a way to detour the wreckage. You can still remember my name. So we can be resilient to the presence of Alzheimer's pathology through the recruitment of yet undamaged pathways. And we create these pathways, this cognitive reserve, by learning new things. Now, ideally, we want these new things to be as rich in meaning as possible, recruiting sight and sound and associations and emotion. So this really doesn't mean doing crossword puzzles. You don't want to simply retrieve information you've already learned, because this is like traveling down old familiar streets, cruising neighborhoods you already know. You want to pave new neural roads. Building an Alzheimer's resistant brain means learning to speak Italian, meeting new friends, reading a book, or listening to a great TED Talk. And if despite all of this, you are someday diagnosed with Alzheimer's, there are 3 lessons I've learned from my grandmother and the dozens of people I've come to know living with this disease. Diagnosis doesn't mean you're dying tomorrow. Keep living. You won't lose your emotional memory. You'll still be able to understand love and joy. You might not remember what I said 5 minutes ago, but you'll remember how I made you feel. And you are more than what you can remember. Thank you.
So, for me, the most important takeaway from this talk is that there are things we can do to build up that cognitive reserve. So that, as she was saying, if one part of our brain is struggling, we have another pathway to help us to get where we need to be. But we need to challenge ourselves daily. Use it or lose it applies to the brain just as it does to every other part of our body. Now, as I mentioned, this talk is from 2017. And Dr. Genova was mentioning that there currently are really only drugs on the market to help manage the symptoms of dementia. But since she's done that talk, we've got some new what are called disease-modifying treatments that have been approved. Aduhelm and Leqembi. And instead of managing symptoms, these are the first medications on the market that are approved to treat Alzheimer's. But, and this is a big but, to treat it in its very earliest stages. So I'm, by the way, in the process of developing another new webinar that's just about medications and treatments for Alzheimer's and other dementias. So today I'm just going to really very briefly mention the 2 newest ones, mostly because they've been in the news so much. And I do have some links about these on your resource list. So Leqembi is one of the 2 disease-modifying Alzheimer's drugs to receive any kind of FDA approval, and it's actually received full approval now. Aduhelm still only has conditional approval, and that's pending more trial data on safety and efficacy. The drugs are administered by infusion intravenously every few weeks in a clinic setting. Now, right now, as I said, they've only been shown to be effective in early stage Alzheimer's or mild cognitive impairment. So it's important to note they're not a cure. but studies have indicated that by reducing the beta amyloid plaques, remember Dr. Genova was talking about those, that sticky stuff in the brain that interferes with our neural transmission, our cognitive and functional decline may be slowed. However, there's no evidence to show that either of these drugs can restore lost memories or functions. So again, not a cure for Alzheimer's. Leqembi in particular has been shown to modestly slow down cognitive decline in patients who are in the early stages. I keep saying that, but that's important. Now, here's another thing that's kind of important to be thinking about. Data from a large clinical trial suggested that the drug may slow decline by about 5 months over a period of 18 months for the patients who were administered it. So it doesn't sound like a lot, does it? And how the drug might affect a patient's daily life is likely to vary widely. For some people, Leqembi might mean several additional months of being able to follow a recipe, to balance a checkbook, or to accomplish other activities without help. For others, the impact might be much more subtle and possibly barely noticeable. So also the treatment is now available, both Leqembi and Aduhelm, but getting them is not as easy as just picking up a prescription at Rite Aid. The candidate must undergo a thorough medical evaluation, and to qualify, must be diagnosed with early stage Alzheimer's or mild cognitive impairment. Doctors must determine that the patient already has a buildup of that amyloid plaque in their brains. Now, this can be done either by a very specialized PET scan. This PET scan right now is not covered by Medicare. There's talk that it may possibly be fairly soon because it's really the only way to determine if the person has that amyloid buildup, which means it's necessary to, if somebody qualifies to start this drug. But this specialized PET scan costs about $5,000. So the other way that it can be determined if somebody has a buildup of amyloid plaque is if they do a cerebrospinal test, like a kind of a spinal tap test, either through, as I mentioned, through that spinal tap. So Leqembi is currently about $26,000 a year. Medicare has now said that they will pay for it, but remember with Medicare, as with any insurances, they don't cover it 100%. So Medicare will cover it 80%. And then so somebody is probably going to be ending up paying maybe about $5,000 a year. Of course, there's always controversy with any new medication. And I always think it's important to view new information with a critical eye. And as I mentioned, I'll go into more depth about this in a later webinar, but I did briefly want to mention these meds. So if you or your loved one are in the very early stages of Alzheimer's or mild cognitive impairment, this may be something that you might want to be discussing with your physician.